The topic of the Pathwork Steps online meetings and study guides for the month of March 2019 is Pathwork Lecture 199, The Meaning of the Ego and Its Transcendence. And if you've ever wondered how these videos are made, sometimes they are made 3 or 4 times because it doesn't work. Sometimes in trying to present the material, I realize that I haven't got the right angle on it and that I'm babbling a bit. So I've tried this 3 or 4 times, and I finally figured out that the reason I was having trouble is normally I'm able to talk about the lecture in 4 different sections, as if there were 4 different facets of it. In this case, the key of the entire lecture is the very reason I chose to present it. And that is that there is a short version of it that we call ego tricks, meaning that the lecture is handy when boiled down to a page of the different kinds of ways where the ego attempts to avoid transcendence. So the name of the lecture is The Meaning of the Ego and Its Transcendence. But its usefulness, at least to me, has been that it lists all the ways where the ego protests expansion. So while I can break down the lecture into 4 subtopics, it all keeps coming back to the same thing. And when I didn't recognize that, when I attempted to separate and segregate, I wound up stepping on my topics and I found it to be confusing. So I thought I would give it one more go and try again with this larger knowledge. And to some extent, the reason I'm explaining this is that's the process of the ego transcending. That the ego thinks, oh, this is how I've done it before, and this makes sense, and this is how I'll do it again. But that's simplistic, and it's based in the past, not in the reality of this particular lecture. And by trying to stubbornly do it the way it's being done and be linear about it, the ego is trying to get a task done. And that's its job. But there's more involved. My attempts in these videos is to introduce you to a little bit more than you might be able to pick up off the written page. And that's what workshops and sessions and group meetings is all about. This is not about reading and understanding something. Studying any spiritual discipline inevitably is about bringing it to life, lifting it off the page and living it. Practicing the principles in everyday life. So this has been my practice this time, of realizing that I was being simplistic and trying to be too linear, and not realizing that in this case, the entire lecture continues to attach to each different part of it and can't be as easily separated. So with that introduction, I can go ahead and talk about the 4 sections. All the while keeping this 1-page worksheet, which I use and I hand out a lot, handy as a demonstration at each section, which is the other thing that I stumbled over. So the ego, first section of the 4 is ego as a fragmented piece of consciousness, meaning that the ego is not the whole of us. Anyone who's listening to this is interested in spiritual subjects, topics, learnings, experiences. And that's always about something else. It's about a feeling. It's about a knowing. It's about a calling. A sense that there's something out there for us that we haven't found yet, that we haven't identified, that we can't quite name. It's a search. Now, the ego can help us search, but the ego did not generate the desire to search. That came from our real selves. It came from the positive divine aspect of us. Now, the other place I got distracted is I kept trying to bring that into a discussion of the ego, and you can only talk about so many things at once. So I'm going to keep focusing on the ego rather than trying to explain what is actually quite difficult to explain, which is real self, divine nature, etc. So focusing on the ego, that the ego is a fragmented piece of consciousness. It's only a part of who we are. And it's a practical day-to-day part. It doesn't ruminate on philosophy. It doesn't muse. It doesn't even dream. In the lecture, the guide says the ego doesn't feel. It experiences feeling. It experiences emotion. But feelings actually come from the real self. In the same sense, thoughts come from the real self. Thinking about them comes from the ego and the different aspects of ego. So the premise in this first section is that reality is greater than the human experience. And the ego is grounded in the human experience. So it can only see the colors that human beings can see. It can only experience the dimensions that a human being can experience. When the reality, the spiritual reality, can be infinitely greater. But the ego doesn't have experience with that. So it defaults to what it sees, what it can touch, what it can hear, what it can understand, what it can perceive. The dilemma here is it begins to think that that's all there is. And especially if we're adept in this place, we can get to a point where the ego is unwilling to be confused, to be challenged, to go into the unknown, to go somewhere where it's ignorant or unable to participate fully. So not only does this seem like all there is, we build up a resistance, our ego builds up a resistance to exploring and experimenting outside this known area, this field of experience where we feel comfortable and expert at. When I say expert, you don't have to feel perfect at everything, but you know what the street is like, you know what the walls and ceilings are like, you know what pens are for, you know how to operate machinery or devices. That doesn't mean you won't include a new device. But if you were told you didn't need devices, all you had to do was be, the ego doesn't know how to do that. And so it would not be able to support, assist, accelerate in something that outrageously different than what it's used to. So the task of the ego is to not only do what it needs to do, which is very useful and very important. We want to keep the ego. We want a healthy ego. Its task is to not only be its capable self in the real world, its additional task is to integrate with the real self, with the movements of the soul. Now the guide there's no one lecture on soul movements, but the guide mentions them periodically throughout. He includes feelings, thoughts, dreams, imagination, eros, not erotic, but eros. That calling, that sense of wanting something, the soft, gentle pull towards, is a soul movement. These are soul movements rather than a phone ringing or a letter to be answered or a question to be answered. And these are places where we explore without necessarily knowing what we're doing there, what the actual goal is. These are not things that the ego does well. So the ego needs to integrate with these soul movements so that the ego can begin to include them in its beingness and to enlarge. And this is uncomfortable for the ego. And therefore it tends to protect its territory, it tends to protect what it knows, wants to stay there. And so there is a resistance to expansion. And yet expansion is part of its task. Without expansion, the ego just becomes rigid and halts growth rather than supports it. So the guide gave a list of things that the ego does well. It collects, repeats, copies, memorizes, sorts out, selects, makes up the mind, moves forward on inner and outer goals. All of these things it does wonderfully. And we need all these things to operate in the world. As I speak to you, I am selecting words, putting sentences together, seeing ideas in my mind and pulling them into format. Without the ego, I cannot do this. I can still be who I am. But communication, real world communication, requires structure. And the ego gives us some structure. A bit like bones, walking on the planet without any bones, hard to stand up as tall as we are. So because the ego feels, if the ego feels more and more comfortable with these tasks and does not know the area of growth and expansion, when asked to expand, the ego can feel like it is losing itself. And the ego, being an earthbound system, feels annihilated. It feels as if its known area is life and the unknown is death. That being asked to grow and transform is giving something up. It does not see this as a necessary stage. Of course, you give up the old things and you get the new things, and then you combine the two. It sees only the giving up. It does not see the getting. So the ego interprets growth and expansion as death. Now, because of this, I chose to integrate into all 4 sections the Kubler-Ross stages of death, because it mirrors what the lecture is speaking of. And so stages of death as an analogy for what the ego feels it's going through and how it resists and fights and struggles for what it considers to be life. So week 1 was looking at it as a fragmented piece of consciousness. That's actually the hardest part, because to identify the ego means to see it as slightly separate, and we sometimes just can't see the difference between our ego and ourselves, our larger self. Week 2 was on the tricks of the ego, and they are numerous. Tricks of the ego, the guide separates them into clusters to help us understand there are different styles and types of tricks. And he uses Pathwork Lecture 30, Pride, Self-Will, and Fear, as a basis for this. So for instance, when pride, the trick of pride is to say, I'm superior, I don't need to. Trick of pride would be to want to look good and not to want to appear ignorant. So the trick would be that the ego wants to appear competent, in control, and comfortable at any expense. So it's going to justify anything that makes it feel in control, comfortable, aware, and competent. So those would be about pride. The self-will tricks are stubbornness, resistance, defiance, rigidity, even negativity. Can also be a bit of laziness or tiredness. That sounds contrary, but sometimes we just make a decision we're too tired. We all know this, where we say I'm tired, and then something we want to do comes along and suddenly we're not tired anymore. So one of the ways to identify an ego trick is by seeing how it's discrepant, how it says I'm tired when all of a sudden it has energy when it wants to do something. When it says I'm confused unless it wants to act. When it says I can't remember unless it wants to get something done. And to notice these changes is to notice that these are choices that are being made, rather than situations we must endure. And the reason they are called ego tricks is they're meant to deceive us. They're meant to deceive us into leaving the ego where it is, where it wants to be, instead of coming into territory where it's just not as comfortable. So a very large portion of this is fear, and the fear is based on the ego thinking that it's going to be replaced or dissolved or die. Fear would say, it would fill you with worry and apprehension. It's very easy to, I know the phrase as gin up, meaning to manufacture. Perhaps you have experienced this where the emotions are manufactured, and fear is easily manufactured. It's easily created by repeating anxious statements or exaggerating a hazard or emphasizing, dramatizing a risk, or focusing only on the risk or the drama instead of the wider picture. So this would be a trick of the ego to create fear specifically to avoid doing something. So fear says, let me stay here instead of there. That is dangerous. This is safe. And the trick part is that involves growth and enlargement, and this involves just being comfortable. And yet it's expressed differently. Another trick of the ego is fear and suspicion, about using the differences between us to claim that that's the reason you shouldn't trust, that's the reason you should fear, that's the reason you shouldn't listen. And although there are some, there's more complexity here than I'm putting. What I am suggesting is we do have to simplify to see these as tricks. Now, sometimes they have grain of truth in them, and that makes them a very effective trick. So if there's a little truth and it's just being exaggerated, we have more tendency to believe it because we sense that there's some truth in it, rather than something that's completely made up, completely invented. And we can tell those kinds of things. So ego tricks that are simply dreamt up are easier to identify. Ego tricks that are based on some element of truth can be more difficult to see through. Creating fear of positive states, genuinely. This one is about maintaining safety by denying pleasure and bliss. This is a very tricky one, where the ego knows that pleasure and bliss are aspects of the real self, and they are genuinely uncontrollable. You can't control pleasure and bliss. You can't control surprise. You can't control real love. And so the ego doesn't trust these things because they cannot be controlled. And so by denying them, it stays in a negative contracted area, but that feels safe. So this is where the illusion of safety and staying still and contracted is used to deny a more free-flowing life force, just because it's beyond the ego's knowing. And also inattentiveness, lack of attention, wandering, can be a trick. It can be a way of avoiding something. Now, the only way to know if something is a trick is to examine it. So each month I put in a little section on daily review. Daily review is the cheapest, easiest, most profound way to find out what you are thinking and feeling in a longer time period than you may be aware of. Sometimes, well, let me give this analogy. I talk about when you take a magnet and you drag it through sand, it can pick up minuscule iron filings that you can't see in the sand you didn't even know was there. So you drag a magnet through sand and you pick up the magnet and it's got spiky hair on it from all the little iron filings and fragments. That's what daily review does. Daily review is a way of noticing over time what keeps coming back, what keeps happening. Habits that are so benign, so small, so modest that you don't realize them, and yet the hallmark of something that is not in truth is that it causes pain and disharmony. So in daily review, we look for the disharmonies that we feel, and then at the end of the week, end of the month, we look at all the disharmonies and we try to shake them around and try to find patterns out of them. So this is a very good way to find ego tricks if they're not large and obvious for you. And of course, a trick truly wants to be innocuous. It does not want to be found. So that's the section on ego trick. When we get to the vicious circle, which is section number 3, that's when the specific Kubler-Ross stages of death matched the guide's description of the vicious circle. So in the Kubler-Ross model, when you're, I'm going to exaggerate because it's easier, when you're given a terminal diagnosis, you're going to die. The stages are first, that you deny it. Second, that you become angry about it. Third, that you bargain. Argue with God, argue with the doctor, argue with your diet. If I do this, then this. Then there's depression, where you pretend to give up, but you're just trying to avoid dealing with what's going on. And stage 5 is acceptance. The guide describes this as a vicious circle, where when the ego sees something that it doesn't like, that is life-threatening for it, looks like death, dissolution, change, the ego will go into denial. It will go into anger, protest. It will bargain. Here, tell me how to do it and I'll do it. But in that tell me how to do it, it's very sneaky, because the ego is attempting to control something so that it doesn't have to grow and expand. It wants a linear representation of instructions, because it knows it will keep it grounded in reality, which is its area of expertise. So denial, anger, bargaining, and depression, where we say we don't care, where we get distracted, where we get confused, and we're trying to unhook from an unpleasant possibility. This is the ego, stages that the ego will go through. And then finally, it may reach a stage of acceptance. That's the way out of the vicious circle. In the way out, what is needed is to accept the difficulties of this integration process as real. That growth and expansion is going to sting a little bit. It's going to hurt. It's like being an athlete or a ballerina or anything where you have to truly extend yourself to constantly expand and grow. You'll have tired muscles, you'll have tired hands, your brain will hurt, long hours, extra effort expended. There are difficulties. And something can be gained from that. So the ego needs to accept that growth and expansion are its destiny, and that difficulties will be real. Not to deny them, not to argue, not to push them away, but to attempt to integrate and work with them. And secondly, the ego needs to identify and stop its tricks. We need to get the ego on board in the partnership. It needs to turn itself in and help understand its own limitations, its own fears, and that is part of its growing. That's part of awareness. First, we have to become aware that we're resistant. And then we can work with the resistance, and we're already bigger than the resistance when we work with it. So this is how we get out of the vicious circle of being afraid of dying. In the last section, I found the phrase, spiritual movement is effortless. And in this section, I like to think in terms of when children learn to walk, they don't think about how much work it's going to take. It's intuitive, it's organic, and if they are physically capable of doing so, and nobody sits on them or ties them up, all children learn to walk. They don't count the time, they don't care. It's something they want. It will give them freedom, and they don't care how long it takes or how long or how hard it is, and they don't care really how many times they fall down. It may slow them down to find out that they fall and it hurts and it stings. They may want to take it slower, but they will learn to walk. That's what spiritual growth is like. It does hurt. We do fall down. We have to learn from our mistakes. We need to identify dangers. We need to see where it's safe to expand and where sometimes it's prudent to slow down. But spiritual growth is effortless when we're aligned and when we're supported. The ego can be a great support, which is why we need a healthy ego. This is how Pathwork teaches it. Sometimes this turns into semantics. So it is possible that the word ego as I use it is different from the ego as other people hear it, teach it, or use it. So substitute word of your choice. The part of you that shows up, enacts with other people, chooses their words, picks things up with their hands. These are ego areas. We need this. We want this. We want it to perform with health and vigor. And we want more. And that's what a spiritual journey is about, is wanting more. And to gain that, we need to go get that book and read that book, turn on the lights, be healthy, eat properly. All these things the ego can help us with, and we can use the health of the ego to help us expand. And then it's a decision whether something seems like work or play, and how much play we have. It's an invitation to reach for pleasure, even though pleasure is going to take us on a journey that we may not fully understand. So thanks for your interest in Pathwork. Thanks for watching, and take care.